pleasure to introduce via Skype Bill McKibben, who is the author of dozens of books about the environment, beginning with The End of Nature in 1989, which is regarded as the first book for a general audience on climate change. Bill is the founder of the grassroots climate campaign 350.org, which has coordinated 15,000 rallies in nearly 200 countries since 2009. Time magazine called him the planet's best green journalist, and the Boston Globe said in 2010 that he was probably the country's most important environmentalist. As the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College, excuse me, he holds honorary degrees from a dozen colleges, including the University of Massachusetts in Maine, SUNY New York, and Whittier and Colgate colleges. In 2011, he was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So please join me in welcoming Bill McKibben.
Thank you all. It's such a pleasure to be with you, if only electronically, and I wish I was there in person. Things have been slightly chaotic in my life for the last few months for reasons I'll describe, because we've been doing this huge pipeline crusade that the initial stages of which came to an end anyway on Thursday with what amounted to a victory. And so that's why I'm not there, because I've been out, so many other places had to be on the road. But I really wanted to join you all because you're in a really important spot too, and there's a lot of fights coming right in your direction, as you know. Where to begin? Let me talk for a minute. Let's get the really unpleasant stuff out of the way right at the start. Let me talk about where we stand scientifically with climate change. I did write the first book about global warming way back in 1989. Back then, we knew most of what we really needed to know about climate change. We knew that when you burned coal and gas and oil, you put carbon in the atmosphere. And we knew that the molecular structure of that carbon trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. And the only thing we didn't know then was, how quickly this was going to pinch and how hard. And the truth is, it's pinched harder and faster than we expected. Scientists by nature are conservative, and it was hard to does anybody else hear this? Yeah. Okay. It was hard for any of us to imagine just how quickly we were going to see change. My most recent book, a kind of bookend to The End of Nature, was a book that came out maybe 2 years ago called Earth, but spelled wrong, E-A-A-R-T-H, and the reason was, the kind of conceit was, that the planet had already changed enough that it really deserved a new name. I mean, same number of continents, gravity still applies, but the ocean's about 30% more acid than it was. Those of you who can remember those first pictures from Apollo 8 of our planet floating in space will be saddened to know that there's 40% less ice in the summer up top than there used to be. On and on and on and on. All of this, well, I could adduce proofs like this for a very long time. Suffice it to say that we have left the Holocene, the 10,000-year period of benign climatic stability that underwrote the rise of human civilization. If you look even at the last couple of years, you get a sense what that means. We've had, in 2010, the warmest year for which we have records. 19 nations set new all-time temperature records. We were on the phone one day with our 350.org colleagues in Pakistan, and one of them said that it's really hot here today, which I was surprised to hear. It was summertime, and it's always hot in summer in Pakistan. He said, no, it's really hot. We just set the new all-time Asia temperature record. It was 129 degrees today. It's like, okay, that is very hot. One of the things that happens with heat, and maybe this is the most important physical fact for this century, is that warm air holds more water vapor than cold air does. And that means that you increase dramatically the possibilities both of drought and of flood. So in arid areas, we've seen far more evaporation. and that evaporation has been dangerous. Summer 2010, it was Russia that had the biggest heat wave and drought they ever had. Bad enough that the Kremlin stopped all grain export to the rest of the world. Since Russia is the third biggest grain exporter on the planet in a normal year, this was a big deal. It caused the price of grain to shoot up about 70% on world markets. It's pretty much stayed there ever since because we've had one crop failure after another. And the result is that we added a couple of 100 million people to the rolls of those who were malnourished and without enough to eat. That's very, very bad news, obviously. This year, the intense droughts are in the Horn of Africa, but also the American Southwest, which is undergoing a drought that meteorologists describe as deeper than the drought of the Dust Bowl years. There were huge swaths of forest fires about 7 weeks ago outside Austin, killed a bunch of people. The chief of the Texas Forest Firefighting Service said, "No human being has ever fought fire in conditions like this." And he was right. There was essentially no humidity. Once all that water is evaporated up into the air, it's going to come down. And that's what we're seeing place after place after place. So 2010 in the summer, it was Pakistan. Worst flood ever. About a quarter of the country underwater, 20 million people out of their homes. Christmas time last year, it was Queensland and Australia. Then it was the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers, which had absolutely record flood. That's because record snowpack, which is what you get when you have record rainfall and that's below 32 degrees, melted as record rains fell. Both those rivers were out of their banks. Closer to home, in Vermont, where I live, and in upstate New York, where you live, the tail ends of tropical storms Irene and Katya brought completely unprecedented rainfall to our parts of the world. Irene, as it went up the East Coast, passed over record warm seawater off the coast of New York and New Jersey, allowing it to soak up huge amounts of moisture. When it dumped it on Vermont, we set new one-day rainfall records that were 25 or 30% bigger in places than ever in the hundreds of years of record keeping. That's not supposed to happen. If you have long-standing records like that, you should break them by a millimeter here or a quarter inch there. Binghamton set a new one-day rainfall record 60% higher than its previous one. These are crazy. This is a different kind of planet that this rain is falling on. And the trouble is, all this is happening with relatively early into the global warming era. So far, we've only increased the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree, added about 3/4 of a watt per square meter of the Earth's surface of extra solar energy. Scientists who predicted everything that happened so far tell us with quite blunt assurance, quite robust confidence, that unless we get our act together quickly, and by getting our act together, I mean getting off coal and gas and oil faster than any government currently plans to, we'll see that turn into 4 or 5 or 6 degrees before the century is out. And if that happens, there's no reason to think that we can deal with that as a civilization. Recent data from Stanford and the University of Washington showed that from this point in, every degree increase in temperature should drop grain yields about 10%. So we're talking about a world that may have 20 or 30% fewer calories by the time our children are in their prime. And if that happens, there's no possibility of development or progress or peace or social justice or anything else. There's just trouble. We can't let that trouble happen. And so that's what I really want to just talk to you about for a few minutes, what we're trying to do to keep it from happening. The reason it's happening is, well, let's look at the good news first. The scientific method has worked remarkably well. Scientists have come up with, they crunch a difficult problem in physics and chemistry and given us a strong answer. And the engineering method worked pretty well. People have come up with a lot of solutions, and some of them you know all about, wind energy and solar energy. This stuff works. I was just in China doing an article for the National Geographic, and the Chinese are building lots of coal plants, but they're also doing lots of other things, including huge amounts of renewable energy. The most important thing, for instance, that they've done is the relatively low-tech solar hot water installations on people's roofs. More than a quarter of China have them. When 250 million Chinese take a shower, at the end of the day, the hot water is coming off their roof. That's compared to about less than 1% of Americans. And what it demonstrates is a failure not of science or engineering, but of politics. At the end of my day at Kinmen Solor in China, the biggest of these solar thermal companies, the president, Wang Ming, asked me into his sort of private office, and there he had a sort of small museum. And the pride of place in that museum was a kind of rusting, old solar thermal panel. He asked me if I knew what it was, and I said that I didn't. And he said that was one of the panels that Jimmy Carter put on the White House in 1979, and Ronald Reagan took down in 1985. Okay? To me, that illustrates perfectly exactly why we're in trouble. And it illustrates exactly why we need to build movements. It's not that our political leaders haven't been made well aware of what the problem is. Our theory for a long time was that our scientists and policy people would talk calmly to our political leaders about the biggest problem the world has ever faced, and they would take action. What we failed to figure out was that while they were doing this, the fossil fuel industry would be bellowing in the other ear of our political leaders, and bellowing at them in this kind of mix of threats and promises that would drown out reason and science. That's just what happened. The fossil fuel industry is the richest enterprise in the history of the planet. Exxon just reported its quarterly earnings last week. They made more money last quarter than any company in the history of money. And that's been enough. Since you know a little bit about our political system, you know that it doesn't really take much more than money to slow things down, gum things up, delay things from happening. That's what they wanted, and they've been successful. In order to beat them, we're going to need to find a different currency to work in, and that's why we build movements. And 350.org is a good example of that. It's kind of the first big global climate movement, grassroots movement. It takes its odd name from a piece of scientific data points. In January of 2008, our most important climatologist, Jim Hansen, at NASA, put out a paper saying, we know enough about climate to know how much carbon is too much. Any value for carbon greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. That's strong language for scientists to use. It's stronger still when you know that wherever you are today, you know, in Corning or in China or in New Zealand or wherever you are, the atmosphere is 393 parts per million CO2, already too hot. We chose the name not only because it makes it clear that global warming is a present crisis, not a future threat, but also because we were trying to work globally. And unlike words, Arabic numerals actually cross linguistic boundaries. And so we figured we might be able to rally people around it. It was kind of a loose hope at first, because we really had no resources or anything. There was me and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury College in Vermont, where I teach. 7 was an apt number because there are, after all, 7 continents. So each one of them took one, and we went to work. And 18 months later, we had the kind of first big coming out party for this number all over the world. And it was a pretty good one. Not because of our brilliant organizing, but because there were so many people around the world like yourselves who are worried about climate change, but didn't really know, it always felt too big a problem to take on, you know, with anything more than the kind of slightly token efforts around one's own house. Given a chance to do the same thing on the same day, people responded. And that first day, which was just about exactly 2 years ago, there were 5,100 rallies in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. And after that, we did not win. We went to Copenhagen and the big climate summit, and we convinced 117 nations to sign on to this 350 target. But they were the wrong 117 nations, all the poorest ones. And so we, the big addicts led by our own country refused to really do anything. The whole conference fell apart. So we've continued trying to build these movements, and we've had 2 more of these huge global days of action. The most recent one was in late September, and focused on bicycles. It was very beautiful, and I'm sure that there are people there who took part in this, and I'm grateful for it. Thank you. We'll continue building this kind of movement all over the world. We're active in every country except North Korea. But we're also figuring out that we have to be more aggressive some of the time too. And hence this fight over the last 4 months about this pipeline from the tar sands of northern Alberta down to the Gulf of Mexico. It was important because this is the second largest pool of carbon on Earth, these tar sands. If we could burn them off all tonight, which thank God we can't, but if we could, we would instantly take the planet's carbon concentration from 393 parts per million to 540 parts per million. If it was not hell on Earth, it would be a similar temperature. And so we were determined to try and fight this, especially because for once our crazy Congress was not involved and the president would have to make the final call. And so we went to the White House in August and had what turned into the largest civil disobedience action in this country in about 35 years. And it was really powerful. Some of us had to spend a few days in jail, but that was okay, because in the end it kind of was the ante to get us into this game. And then we've, the last 3 months, fought as hard as we possibly could. Every place the president went, there were people talking to him about Keystone XL loudly, the name of this pipeline. We went to his campaign offices, and we rallied last Sunday around the White House. We decided to see if we could bring enough people to Washington to circle the White House, something that people hadn't tried at least in 40 or 50 years. We didn't know how many people it would take. As it turns out, we had more than enough. Last Sunday, they were stacked 5 deep all around the White House. It was a beautiful sign. It's a beautiful sight. It couldn't have been more wonderful. And the thing that made it really wonderful was that on Thursday, the president announced that this pipeline was not getting built, at least not anytime soon. Back to the State Department for a full-on review. The earliest it could possibly even come back is the first quarter of 2013. Most of the commercial analysts think that by that time TransCanada will have abandoned the pipeline route. There are no permanent victories in this business. It's entirely possible that there'll be other pipelines proposed. We'll have to fight those. There's another set of pipelines in Canada that are proposed. I'm going up to Vancouver on Tuesday to help work on those. On and on and on. And of course, I think it should be taken for granted that President Romney would, approve 25 pipelines if anyone asked him to, and I'm pretty sure they will. So no permanent victories, but this was one of these good examples where people power trumped corporate power for once. It's pretty rare, so we're in a pretty good mood about it. Now, the problem is that we're sort of in the position of, the little Dutch boy trying to put a finger in a dike, except that there's dozens of dikes all over the world that we have to try and run that many fingers. The rational way to go about this would be to have legislation that puts a price on carbon, that makes carbon pay for the damage it does in the atmosphere. And that's one of the things we're going to have to keep fighting for. But it's not going to happen in this current Congress, that's for sure. And it may take a while in our crazy political culture to get it. And so in the meantime, we will have to keep putting fingers in dikes and trying to stop that which just has to be stopped. One of the important places that we have to fight on all the frontiers of this sort of emerging extreme energy industry that's coming up. Since we're running out of easy to get at oil, you know, the stuff where you just put a drill bit in the ground and up it comes, you know. People are not taking that as they should, as the kind of signal to make the transition to wind and sun, but instead as the signal to look to sort of rip apart the earth to find what hydrocarbons are left. And that's what's going on. That's why we're up in this tar sands, which is terrible, gunky, dirty oil that no one would ever use if they had any choice. That's why we're doing deep sea oil drilling in places like the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico. It's why we're doing mountaintop removal coal mining. One of the few times industry hasn't actually the euphemism for something. Mountaintop removal is exactly what we do. And it's why we're doing fracking all across the Northeast. That fracking fight is extremely important, and it's one of the next points in this battle. It's extremely important, not only because it will tear up water resources and landscaping things in the beautiful Northeast, but I'm afraid even more importantly, because it has really severe global warming implications. As you frack stuff, a lot of methane escapes to the atmosphere. It's a potent global warming gas. But even if it didn't, getting our hands on huge quantities of gas is enough to ensure that the fossil fuel age will last long enough to overheat the planet. And so this is a very important fight. And the next stage of it, for those of you who can get there and follow along, is November 21st. The Delaware River Basin Commission, composed of representatives of the Army Corps of Engineers and of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, will pass will vote on a provision to allow a huge, large-scale fracking across the Delaware River Basin. It would be important to defeat that, just as it's important across New York to try and somehow figure out how to extend this moratorium on fracking that's going on. So these are the kind of fights that we're in right now. And they're very hard fights, but occasionally they come out just right. And we're going to need more people willing to stand up and fight. I don't know. I mean, there's no, I gotta say as I close here, there's no guarantee that we're going to win many of these. There are scientists who think we've waited too long to get started about climate change. There are political scientists who think there's just too much power on the other side. But this pipeline fight shows that if people really, really come out, if they really try and build a movement, that sometimes you can beat corporate power, and we've got to start doing it and hope that it gives us some momentum and get us on a roll. And so that's where we need your help. We need you at 350.org, and we need you working in your local communities to do this kind of stuff. No guarantee we're going to win. Just the guarantee that there are, and I know this to be true because I've traveled the planet the last 3 or 4 years spewing carbon behind me. There are rooms like the one you're in all over the planet, many of them in places where people have done nothing to contribute to this problem. And yet nonetheless, they're there willing to try and figure out how to work together to solve. And it's always a great honor to be in those rooms, and it's a great honor to be in this one, if only virtually. And I thank you in advance for all the work you'll do and the time ahead, the work you've already done. And especially good to see people like Ruth who are down there helping us with this pipeline battle in DC. I wish I could tell you everything going to come out okay. Can't tell you that. Can't tell you it will be a great honor to just work shoulder to shoulder with you in the years going forward. Thank you guys very, very much.